It was 4:15 a.m. on a brutal Tuesday in mid-March. The Yakima Valley was locked in the jaws of a late freeze. The wind howling off the Cascade Mountains didn't just blow, it scraped. It dragged across the barren, gray hardpan of the valley floor, rattling the desiccated branches of 10,000 apple trees. The sound was distinct. It sounded like old bones clapping together in the dark. A flashlight beam cut through the freezing dust. At the base of an 80-year-old Honeycrisp tree, kneeling in soil that was as compacted and cracked as concrete, was Evelyn. She was 40 years old. Her Carhartt jacket was frayed at the cuffs, her knuckles split and stained black from winter pruning. She didn't look at the massive skeletal trees stretching into the horizon. Instead, she shone the flashlight onto a small, weathered wooden block tied to a low branch. Drilled into the wood were dozens of tiny holes. Inside one hole, resting in a hollow cardboard tube, was a gray cocoon no larger than a pinto bean. She pulled off her thick leather glove. She pressed her bare index finger against the freezing wood right beside the hole. She held her breath, ignoring the wind stinging her eyes. She waited, just feeling, protecting something that the rest of the world couldn't even see. This tiny gray cocoon was an Osmia lignaria, a native blue orchard mason bee. It was asleep, and it was all Evelyn had left. 9 days ago, she had sat in a sterilized, fluorescent-lit office in downtown Wenatchee. The loan officer had pushed a manila folder across the desk. Inside was a piece of paper with a red circle drawn around a very specific, uncompromising number, $142 on $500, a balloon payment due in exactly 18 months. If she missed it, the bank would foreclose on the 40-acre orchard her family had worked for 3 generations. The land would be sold to AgriCorp Holdings, ripped up, paved over, and turned into a temperature-controlled logistics hub. When she walked out of the bank that day, her neighbor Garnet was leaning against the hood of his F-250 pickup. Garnet farmed 600 acres of high-density, chemically optimized Cosmic Crisp apples. His tractors were GPS-guided. His trees looked like perfect, identical clones. He looked at Evelyn's muddy boots. He spat a sunflower seed onto the pavement. "I saw the foreclosure notice listed in the county clerk's office, Evie," Garnet said, his voice flat. "You can't pay the bank with weeds and sentiment. Sell it now. Take what equity you have. You're trying to run a boutique on a battlefield." Evelyn hadn't said a word. She had just reached into her jacket pocket, her fingers wrapped tightly around a heavy, tarnished brass inhaler. It had belonged to her father. For 30 years, her father had followed the industrial playbook. He sprayed the synthetic nitrogen. He drenched the soil in glyphosate. He pumped the chemical fungicides into the canopy. He chased scale and volume, trying to beat the massive corporations at their own game. It didn't make him rich. It made the soil dead. It bleached the earth gray. It wiped out the native insects. And eventually, the chemical drift destroyed his lungs. He died gasping for air on the porch of the farmhouse, staring at an orchard that had become a sterile factory. Evelyn was not going to run a factory. She refused to spray. She refused to chase massive volume. Her philosophy was dangerous in this valley. Create the absolute highest nutritional value from the smallest, most resilient resources. But the system does not tolerate anomalies. By early April, the agricultural supply chain crisis hit. Colony collapse disorder had ravaged the commercial honeybee industry. The cost to rent a single hive of European honeybees, an absolute necessity to pollinate an apple orchard, had skyrocketed from $60 to $250. Evelyn needed 80 hives. She needed $20,000 just to rent bugs for 2 weeks. She had exactly $1,212 in her checking account. She couldn't buy her way out. She couldn't force it. The commercial pipeline had cut her off. So she turned to the wooden blocks. Evelyn didn't need rented European honeybees. She needed the locals, the Osmia lignaria, the blue orchard mason bee, time compresses, boots hitting the dirt, heavy breathing, the metallic clang of a digging bar striking hard pan. Evelyn worked. For 3 weeks straight, she didn't sleep more than 4 hours a night. The industrial farming of the past had left the orchard floor compacted into a suffocating crust. Water just ran off it. Nothing could live in it. She swung a 50-pound broad fork into the earth. Crack. She leaned her entire body weight backward. The tines tore through the crust. Rip. She moved back 10 inches. Swung again. Crack. She didn't hire a crew. She couldn't. She dragged 100-pound sacks of locally sourced wood chips and spread them by hand. She sowed white clover, daikon radish, and yarrow down the center of every row. She was physically rebuilding the mycorrhizal fungal networks, the underground biological internet of the soil. When fungal threads connect to tree roots, they act as massive extensions, pulling water and phosphorus from deep underground, transferring it to the trees in exchange for liquid carbon. But fungi need living soil, and living soil takes sweat. Her shoulders knotted. Her lower back burned with a dull, screaming ache. Blisters on her palms popped, bled, and turned into yellow calluses. She didn't stop. She broke the hard pan, row by row, acre by acre. Time expands. By late April, the orchard transformed. The white clover bloomed. The soil changed color from dead gray to rich coffee ground brown. If you knelt down and pressed your hands into the dirt, it didn't feel like stone anymore. It felt like a sponge. It smelled like rain and deep woods. And then the temperature warmed. Inside the tiny wooden blocks, the gray cocoons began to vibrate. Evelyn stood in the center of the orchard at dawn. The silence was broken by a low, chaotic hum. Not the organized military drone of a commercial honeybee hive. This was wilder. The mason bees emerged. Here is the scientific reality. A European honeybee is polite. It lands delicately on an apple blossom, sips the nectar, and carefully packs the pollen onto its legs. It takes 40,000 honeybees to pollinate an acre. A mason bee is a mess. It doesn't pack pollen on its legs. It carries it loose on its hairy belly. It doesn't land delicately. It belly flops. It crashes into the center of the blossom, rolling around like a dog in the mud, covering itself in pollen, and then careens violently into the next flower. Because of this chaotic full-body contact, a single mason bee pollinates 95% of the flowers it touches. A honeybee only pollinates 5%. Evelyn only needed 400 female mason bees to do the work of 40,000 honeybees. She watched them crash into the pale pink honeycrisp blossoms. The air was alive. The understory was buzzing. For the first time in 30 years, the orchard was an ecosystem, not a factory. But nature does not care about your redemption arc. It happened on the night of April 28th. Evelyn was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the $140, $500 bank notice, when the weather radio on the counter shrieked. A high-pitched emergency tone. Warning! Severe radiation frost imminent for the Yakima Valley. Temperatures expected to plummet to 22 degrees Fahrenheit between 0200 and 600 hours. Evelyn stopped breathing. 22 degrees. The apple blossoms were fully open. At 27 degrees, a blossom takes 10% damage. At 24 degrees, it takes 90% damage. At 22 degrees, the cellular walls inside the flower freeze, expand, and shatter. The blossom dies. The apple never forms. The entire crop, the entire year's income, is annihilated in 3 hours. Industrial farms survive this by turning on massive diesel-powered wind machines that mix the warm upper air with the cold ground air. Or they ignite hundreds of smudge pots, burning crude oil to heat the sky. Evelyn had no wind machines. She had no oil. Time compresses. She kicked her chair back. It slammed against the wall. She grabbed her keys, her headlamp, and ran into the freezing black night. The air was terrifyingly still. The sky was completely clear, pulling the heat radiating from the earth straight up into the vacuum of space. The temperature was already dropping. 28 degrees. She ran to the pump house. She had exactly one weapon left: water. She wrenched the heavy iron valve open. The ancient agricultural pump screamed to life, drawing water from the deep well. Water rushed through the main lines, shooting up into the micro-sprinklers positioned above the tree canopies. It sounds like madness. To save the blossoms from freezing, she was going to cover them in water. But it was pure physics, the latent heat of fusion. When liquid water turns into solid ice, it undergoes a phase change. During that exact moment of freezing, the water releases a tiny amount of latent thermal energy into whatever it is touching. As long as Evelyn kept spraying liquid water onto the blossoms, and as long as that water was actively freezing into ice, the temperature inside the ice shell would remain at exactly 32 degrees Fahrenheit. It would not drop to 22. The ice would act as an igloo. But the margin of error was zero. If the pump failed, if the water stopped flowing even for 10 minutes, the ice would drop to ambient temperature, and the blossoms would die instantly. She sprinted through the dark rows, the headlamp cutting through the mist of the sprinklers. The water hit her jacket, freezing instantly. Her hair turned into rigid icicles. 26 degrees. The water falling on the trees began to freeze. The branches groaned under the weight. 24 degrees. Evelyn dragged a massive frozen rubber hose to a dry corner where the sprinklers couldn't reach. She sprayed it by hand. Her fingers went completely numb. The pain in her joints was blinding. She couldn't feel her feet. 22 degrees, 3 a.m. The pump engine sputtered. A violent cough. The water pressure dropped. Evelyn dropped the hose. She sprinted back to the pump house, slipping on the sheer ice covering the ground. She crashed hard onto her knees, tearing the fabric of her pants, the ice biting into her skin. She didn't stop. She crawled, pushed herself up, and reached the engine. The intake filter was freezing over. Ice crystals were blocking the airflow. She pulled off her glove. She used her bare, bleeding fingers to scrape the jagged ice off the metal mesh of the intake. The metal burned her skin with cold. She scraped. She clawed. The engine gasped, caught the air, and roared back to life. The pressure stabilized. She collapsed against the wooden wall of the pump house. She slid down to the floor, pulling her knees to her chest. She was soaked. She was freezing. She listened to the rhythmic thumping of the pump. She reached into her pocket, pulled out the tarnished brass inhaler, and held it tightly against her shivering chest. She stayed there until the sun came up. When the light broke over the Cascade Mountains, the orchard was an alien landscape. Every tree, every branch, every single pink blossom was encased in crystal clear, solid ice. They looked like glass sculptures. And as the morning sun hit the ice, it began to melt. Water dripped, the ice cracked. Evelyn walked up to the oldest Honeycrisp tree. She reached out with a trembling, bruised hand. She touched a blossom as the ice shell slid off it. The petals were soft. The center was bright, vibrant yellow. It was alive. Time expands. 6 months later, mid-October. The air was crisp and smelled of crushed leaves and wood smoke. A silver Mercedes SUV kicked up dust as it pulled into Evelyn's gravel driveway, parking next to Garnet's battered F-250. Garnet was standing near the packing shed, his arms crossed. He watched as a man in a tailored wool suit stepped out of the Mercedes. The man was a procurement executive from AgriCorp Holdings. Evelyn was at the sorting table, casually wiping a massive dark red Honeycrisp apple with a cloth. The harvest was not just good, it was historic, because the mycorrhizal networks had fed the trees all summer, and the mason bees had achieved 90% pollination. The trees didn't waste energy on thousands of tiny, weak apples. They poured all their sugar into a smaller number of massive, nutrient-dense fruit. The executive walked up to the table. He didn't look at the dirt or the chickens scratching under the trees. He looked at the apples. "We tested the samples you sent to the lab," the executive said, pulling a digital refractometer out of his pocket. The Brix level, the internal sugar and mineral density, came back at 18. Commercial average is 11. I thought the lab made a mistake, so I drove out here to test it myself. Evelyn didn't say a word. She handed him the apple and a pocket knife. The executive sliced a sliver, squeezed the juice onto the glass lens of the refractometer, and held it up to the light. He stared through the lens for a long time. Slowly, he lowered the instrument. He looked at Evelyn. The condescension was entirely gone. "AgriCorp wants to buy your brand," he said quietly. "We want exclusivity. We'll pay off your $140,500 banknote tomorrow. We'll give you $1 million operating line to scale the system across 500 acres. We want you to be our boutique label." Garnet shifted his weight, his eyes wide. He looked at Evelyn. $1 million. It was the ultimate victory. It was the Goliath surrendering to David. Evelyn looked at the executive, then she looked at the apple in his hand. She thought about the dead soil of the past. She thought about the brass inhaler. She thought about the fact that you cannot scale a delicate ecosystem with a corporate checkbook. "No," Evelyn said. Her voice was calm, carrying no anger. The executive blinked. "Excuse me?" "I'm not scaling," she said. "I'm staying on 40 acres. I'm going to pay the banknote next week with the cash from this harvest, and I'm going to keep my name off your trucks." She turned away from the executive and walked over to Garnet. Garnet looked at her. He didn't spit a sunflower seed. He didn't sneer. He looked at the massive apples on the table, then down at the rich, dark soil beneath his boots. He reached out and picked up an apple. He took a bite. The sound of the crunch was loud in the crisp air. He chewed slowly. He swallowed. He looked Evelyn right in the eye. "My soil is dead, Evie," Garnet said softly. "My yields are dropping. The chemicals aren't working anymore." He paused, his pride fighting his desperation, before his shoulders dropped. "Show me how you did it." Evelyn smiled. Not a boastful smile, but a quiet, knowing one. She reached under the sorting table. She pulled out a small weathered wooden block, drilled with tiny holes. Inside the holes were fresh hollow reeds. And inside those reeds were hundreds of sleeping, tiny gray cocoons. The next generation of Osmia lignaria. She pressed the heavy wooden block into Garnet's rough hands. "We start with the bees, Garnet," she said. "Take them, no charge." She wasn't going to build an empire. She was going to build a community. The industrial machine wants you to believe that the only way to survive is to get bigger, to buy more land, to use harsher chemicals, to borrow more money. They want you to believe that success is a volume game. But sometimes the most profound revolutions don't start with a boardroom buyout or a massive factory. Sometimes salvation doesn't come from a tank of synthetic nitrogen. Sometimes salvation is as small as a gray cocoon. Sometimes it's the quiet patience required to break the hard pan of the past and let the earth breathe again. It's the realization that true wealth isn't measured by the acreage you dominate, but by the life you restore. If you watch this far, you already know this channel isn't just about farming. It's about reclaiming our autonomy in a world that tries to mass-produce our souls. We are building a community of people who believe in deep roots, quiet work, and intentional living. Don't just watch the story, be part of the ecosystem. Hit the subscribe button below. Join us. Because next week we are going to dive deep into a story of someone who took the most broken, abandoned piece of architecture in their city and turned it into something that money literally cannot buy. You won't want to miss it.